a wonderful book called Ludlow, about the Ludlow Massacre and various characters, both real and imagined. Authored a number of other collections, including Arrivals to Buried Houses, I'm not sure I remember. Yeah? Is that it? Okay. That's it. Dave makes it.
Well, this is a beautiful occasion, and Price, I'm so glad that you're following Jim. Jim is one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever known. Jim actually has been a great help to me in all kinds of aspects of my life, including helping me unload a huge portion of my library at a very difficult moment. And he was extremely kind in doing that. So Price, I hope that you and I can collaborate on some projects, and I hope Jim and Aaron and I will continue to collaborate on projects. And all of us are devoted to getting the word out there throughout the state, and I think we all have the same goal in mind. I'm getting a little run down by it, but I want to start with some notion of what of the efficacy of laureates in the world. There's an odd way in which we are just vehicles. We're just funnels for the energy that comes from other people. The culture isn't something that's made by buildings, and it's not something that's made by money. Culture is human energy. Culture is human contact. And poetry is one of the vehicles for that kind of energy, that kind of contact. I think one of the reasons we turn to poetry is that we actually have, universally, everywhere on the planet Earth, a need for articulateness. We actually need language that is used well, because we're surrounded by language that is not used well. We're surrounded by a culture of lies, a culture of mendacity, a culture of mediocrity, frankly. Huge, weighty mediocrity everywhere around us. And poets represent an effort to use language clearly, articulately, with great skill and great memorability. Here's a little verse that I bet all the poets in this room will remember. It's by a doctor in New Jersey, a man who had delivered a lot of babies in his life, who had seen a lot of people die, William Carlos Williams. And he says in a long love poem to his wife, Flossie, he says, "My heart rouses, thinking to bring you news of what concerns you and what concerns many men. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." Now, I think he's dead right. I've seen human misery. I've seen good death. I've seen people die well. And I've seen people live well. And one of the things I know is that people who live well and die well are people who make a soul. People who make a soul by rubbing up against the world, by suffering, facing their suffering, and finding ways to articulate it and share it and bring it across as part of the human experience. When we talk about articulateness, and we talk about what Jim mentioned, the global community of poets, the way in which languages unite us as human beings, we're talking about that soul-making experience. And we're talking about the fundamental human need. It's as real as the need for water. It's as real as the need for food. And I discovered in my travels around this state that people are in fact hungry for it. And the people who are not hungry for it don't know what they're missing. And when you, as Jim suggested, when you're you're able to lead them a little bit closer to the fountain and let them drink, they understand that they've been missing something. There's something absolutely wonderful in this. I'm going to tell you a story about a poem. This has to do with men dying for lack of what is found there, as it were. My older brother died when he was 28. He was a student at Colorado College. My father grew up in Trinidad, my mother in Grand Junction. My brother climbed all over the world, and then he was climbing in a mountain in Washington State when he fell to his death at the age of 28. My younger brother was with him. At the memorial service in Seattle, there were hundreds of people because my brother was a popular up-and-coming politician in that city. And a judge got up to deliver a eulogy for my brother. And the judge read his eulogy, told stories about my brother's life, etc. And then he set his papers aside, and he recited a poem that he'd had in his head and in his heart since he was in high school in Chicago many years ago. Here's the poem. I'm going to tell you a couple stories about this poem. It's a poem by Tennyson. The poem was written in the 1840s about the death of Tennyson's friend Arthur Hallam, and it spoke to people in Seattle in 1979. The poem goes like this. Break, 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 on thy cold grey stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister in play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea, but the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. I want to tell you two things about that poem. One is that there's something going on in that poem that prose writers can't do. Only poets can do this. And that is that it's a particular kind of music in words. Prose writers can't do this. When Tennyson establishes a three-beat line, break, 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 on thy cold grey stones, O sea, he probably doesn't know that he's about to break that pattern at a very important moment. It says, break, 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 on thy cold grey stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand. Hear it? And the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea, but the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. Only poets can do that. And that's not something you analyze in a classroom. That's something that acts on the hairs on the back of your neck. That's something that acts on your nervous system, right? I've had students set that poem to music, and it works really, really well. They set it in 4/4 time, and they leave it rest in the 3-beat lines, and then they nail you with the 4-beat measures. One more story about that poem. My great-grandfather came to Colorado, I'm guessing, in the late 1880s, early 1890s. He was postmaster at Walsenburg for a while, and then he ran a company store, one of the notorious company stores that cheated the miners in the Ludlow area for a while, but he was not there at the time of the Ludlow massacre. By then he was a businessman in Trinidad, Colorado. He brought with him a bunch of books that his father in Paris, Missouri had acquired. My great-grandfather's name was George Mason. His father was Abraham Mason, like my own grandfather, Abe. And so I have George Mason's complete works of Dickens, this kind of stuff, this culture that was carried into Colorado from elsewhere in the world. Digging through some family papers not long after my brother's death, I found Abraham Mason's obituary from Paris, Missouri. Abraham Mason was a newspaper editor in Paris, Missouri. So there was the obituary and the paper he had edited. And lo and behold, in the course of the obituary for my great-great-grandfather, that same Tennyson poem was quoted. And here's the great part of the story. The Tennyson poem is misquoted. Which means that the man who was setting the type, or the man who wrote the obituary, or both if they were the same man, was quoting from heart, by heart, from his head, from his memory. Okay? We're talking about a culture of memory, and Price has been a great, great, great representative of that culture in the way he has performed his poems from memory. As long as I've known him, it's been a real pleasure to hear you do that, Price. I want to say one or two other things and finish with a short poem that somebody else had. I was in Fort Morgan and Rush over the last 2 nights, and I've been in, I think, about 35 of the 64 counties of Colorado so far, and the pace has to let up because I do have a day job. This is killing me. It's also my 98 Subaru is gasping, you know, wheezing away. But it was such a pleasure being out in the prairie, and I had forgotten how beautiful it is out there. It's just been so damn long, and I guess I'm a mountain snob. I like to think that everything is more beautiful, particularly when you get over the Front Range and on into the western slope, etc. But it was astonishingly beautiful out there. It was green, and a wonderful young woman named Rachel Kellogg is running a program out in Fort Morgan, and she's having these open mics, and then we'll have a featured poet come in. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes when I hear about open mic readings, I wince a little bit. I think, oh dear, I really got to be patiently listening to a whole range of work here, and sometimes I'm not really happy to listen to it all. But I was delighted by what I heard out in Fort Morgan, including an 8-year-old boy who performed with such brio and such gusto, something that he had copied off the internet. He let us all know, you know, this wasn't original work, but he was learning about language by performing with absolute delight and absolute lack of self-consciousness in front of a pretty good-sized audience, mostly of adults of all ages. There was a college administrator from the junior college out there who got up and recited a poem by Robert Bly. There were people who got up and read their own poems. There were people who got up and read poems for their friends who were too shy to get up and read poems. And that was extraordinary, because one of these guys, who was called a hermit by the reader, was a pretty damn good poet, I thought, pretty exists. And why laureates have a role to play, not as people who are labeled particularly good at what they do, but because we are vehicles for the language, and vehicles for the language of others. So I want to end with the language of another person. This is my favorite Australian poet. Jim and Mary have heard me do this one. I'll tell you a story about her in just a minute. She publishes as Callie Conan Davies, and I think she's one of the best poets in the world. And this is a poem that's set on a beach in Australia, but I bet it will speak to you guys right now. Okay? It's called Under the Sun. She says, taking an hour from time and again, I offer the sun the gold of my skin, brushed by a breeze of couldn't care less. I rest my head on my rolled up dress, till all of give is shift at my hips, and all of need is salt on my lips, and all of time is the tidal span, and all I am, an impression in sand. Yeah, that little I just heard right now is one of the ways in which you know that that's a damn good poem. Callie Conan Davies is somebody I know as Chrissy Mason. She's my wife. And on Thursday, we were interviewed by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. She's now a permanent resident of the United States.